Welcome to Commsverse. This session is called Advanced Microsoft Teams Room Troubleshooting and will be presented by Luke Kannel. Over to you, Luke.
Thanks, Dave, and welcome everybody. First off, huge thank you to the sponsors. These types of community events, I'm sure took hundreds and thousands of hours to pull together, and these types of events wouldn't be possible without the sponsors that are listed here. And it seems to be continuously growing in the last 2 weeks. A little bit about me. I'm Technical Solutions Manager at Logitech, focused on the pre-sales engineering side and assisting the teams in video collaboration, so Logitech Tap, and other MTR related solutions. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm a Microsoft Certified Master, which is somewhat going the way of the dodo bird, but I have migrated many thousands of seats from traditional PBXs to, at the time, OCS, Link, Skype for Business, and Teams, and now I'm focused on the video collaboration side. That's my day job. My night job is member owner of Broken Clock Brewing in Minneapolis, Minnesota, so I like making beer as well as drinking beer. My contact information is below. If you do have any questions outside of the session, feel free to email my personal email address at the bottom there. And one other thing, my girlfriend noted that nobody would believe that this is a photo of me. So in reality, you're seeing me on video now. This is realistically what I look like in these crazy kind of COVID days. Starting off with the agenda, first thing is the prerequisites. This is really intended for those of you that are system administrators, partners, consultants that deploy, manage, and troubleshoot Microsoft Teams rooms. This isn't really a newbie course. We're going to cover deep dive into some log files, some process optimizations to help get the biggest bang for your buck in a Microsoft Teams room solution. The best defense is a good offense in this scenario. What's new? What has released even in the last month that reduces a lot of the troubleshooting time that's necessary because of bug fixes, software updates, firmwares, things like that. And then we'll roll into what should we look at when we're doing hardware and software troubleshooting, both on the physical side as well as the service side, Skype for Business, Exchange, Microsoft Teams, and any other ancillary services that may be connected. And we'll wrap it up with some deep dive in log file analysis and some cool tools that we've found that just make your job easier on a day-to-day basis, how to inventory all of this stuff that's associated with the Microsoft Teams room and make it easier to develop standard operating procedures. What we won't be covering today, each one of the OEMs has their own tool sets. This is really laser focused on what's provided out of the box from Microsoft. We're not going to cover deep dive. I think each OEM has their own tools. We're not going to touch on those today. All right, prereqs. Creating, deploying, and troubleshooting Microsoft Teams room. I think we covered that. Experience with the Teams Admin Center. That'll be very helpful if you're doing any kind of call quality analysis, being able to deep dive into the logs, what it looks like for media flow, audio, video, desktop sharing, and some other pieces. That'll be really helpful in making this session valuable and pointing in the right direction. Some legacy Skype for Business, or I won't say legacy, but some Skype for Business on-prem tools, 2015 and 2019, like CQD, CLS, and Snooper will be helpful. They're not required, but if you're not familiar with them, you should probably look into them because some of the logs that are associated with the Microsoft Teams rooms can still be parsed and viewed in tools like Snooper. And lastly, this is really a process thing, but it's imperative because there's so much information that's gathered in these Microsoft Teams rooms. Getting specific dates and times and gathering as much information when problems do occur is really critical when you're trying to figure out in 10,000 lines of code, figuring out what went wrong, where you can pinpoint and narrow that down to quickly and effectively troubleshoot. And also, I know it seems like it should be intuitive, but clearly document what was expected to happen from the end user perspective and what actually happened. I expected my desktop to share, it didn't, or the screen went blank, something like that. That really leads into clues, gives us clues to be able to figure out where should we start troubleshooting. All right, starting with the what's new. Microsoft very recently released a new PowerShell script for updating the MTR, and it includes both the binary application file within a PowerShell script, showing that Microsoft is making investments in optimizing not just the applications themselves, but the process for deploying the applications across hundreds or thousands of rooms. And then Windows version support, How do we get to the latest supported version? What's the latest recommended version? What's not recommended? And where's that stuff documented? As I said before, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you do have a standard operating procedure, document all of your versions, know where to start from in an optimized solution, it prevents a lot of troubleshooting time on the back end when problems do occur, because you can focus on very specific areas rather than starting with a broad area. All right, so the first thing, Microsoft has released the embedded PowerShell updater. This used to be a combination of tools, an MSI download where you can run with a PowerShell script, and they've chosen to deploy it by a single MSI. It really stemmed from some challenges that occurred with the 4441 of the MTR, and it is now available publicly for download. The actual reason that they released this version is here, and the download itself to the PowerShell file is at the bottom link. Normally, PowerShell scripts are going to be a couple K, 1 to maybe 15K, even if you got a complex PowerShell script. This one is for 300 or 400 megs, because what they did was they took the actual binary application files, put it in the PowerShell script to make it really easy to update. Now, to deploy this, keep in mind it has to be run from an elevated command prompt. So when you get any MTR solution out of the box, don't plug it into a network to start with, as it stands today, and you'll want to run this update. Download this update to a USB stick. You'll open an elevated command prompt, and then you'll pass it the PowerShell command, calling that PowerShell executable, calling the execution policy unrestricted, which allows it to actually run, and then passing it the new script name, which is mtremediate, and the current version is 4.4.63.0.ps1. One of the challenges that were overcome by doing this was there are many different blogs out there from a lot of very competent MVPs, and sometimes there were challenges when an update was run and the versions got out of sync between an older version of MTR and a newer version of MTR, and maybe something's in the Skype user context and in the admin context it's different, so the system would upgrade and downgrade unexpectedly, or at least undesirably. And that is fixed with this script. This really pushes this into the Skype user context when you run this PowerShell command. Finally, wait up to 45 minutes. The script can reboot 2, 3, possibly 4 times when it's applying. So it'll definitely reboot once within maybe 5 to 6 minutes. There'll be a bunch of stuff that's happening in the background. It'll more than likely reboot in another 15 or 20 minutes, but it can take up to 45 minutes to get the MTR up to speed. This is a critical first step in any MTR deployment. All right, Windows version support. This is also critical and very nuanced, related to the MTR applications. The current recommended version, and this is taken right from Microsoft's website, is Windows 10 1903. Microsoft Premier support, Microsoft Managed Room team may say that it's acceptable to do 1909. Certainly take Microsoft's direct guidance in that. The current recommended and documented version is Windows 10 1903. Windows 10 1909 is validated. I'm not completely clear on what validated is. I'm sure once we have this minimum Teams Room application version that currently says coming soon, once that's actually filled out, we can be confident that what we should do in an optimized room will be deploy 1909. I would suggest not doing that unless Microsoft directly recommends you do that, or this changes to a version number that you know that you're in a fully recommended state. And then lastly, Windows 10 2004 not recommended. Pretty brand new version of Windows. There probably isn't enough data to be able to understand what types of issues will occur. And then one other piece of documentation that is pulled from the latest version of MTR, the 4.4.63.0. This is an event log viewer saying exactly how the application is hard-coded to look for and what's actually optimized. So it says to OS 10.0, ends in 356. That's Windows 10 1903. So the application itself currently is recommending Windows 10 1903 when it does its various script checks. I will say this version 900, that includes a couple of the KBs and the updates. I would strongly recommend being at that version, the .900 in Windows 10 1903, because there are some on-screen keyboard fixes that are really critical when you don't have a keyboard and mouse attached to a room. You want that on-screen keyboard to run as efficiently and effectively as possible. Something else that is slated to be released in Q2 of calendar year 2020. So June 22nd, we fully expect this to be released. That's just a fun way of saying it's in development. It should be coming imminently, but in the craziness of the world today, I think some development times have shifted with various other priorities. A lot of the logs that will be going over today will be pullable from the Teams Admin Center. Strongly recommend you do that so you don't need to do a bunch of remote PowerShell to dig into the logs that help you troubleshoot hardware and software problems. All right, what does the hardware troubleshooting look like? We'll break it down really into 4-ish different sections. The OEM devices themselves, making sure firmware is up to date. Driver versions, very important. Lots of service dependencies on various driver versions, what's recommended, what's supported. The display types, we'll have some cool new tools around how to figure out what type of display do I have, what feature capabilities does it have, what firmware version is the display itself. And then lastly, what logs are actually included that can help us troubleshoot hardware issues or challenges in the MTR solution. A quick rundown of the directory structure associated with the MTR log gathering application. We'll cover in a little bit more detail, but the bottom 3 are actually files that help us do a fair amount of hardware troubleshooting. All right, OEM devices. This one, since I do work at Logitech, I pulled this from Logitech Sync. Similar stuff is available across the OEMs to be able to identify what firmware is available. Rather than stating simply, I have the latest firmware version, document all of the components through the various tools to ensure that any manufacturer OEM knows exactly what firmware version each of the components are so they can provide efficient and effective troubleshooting. And that applies to mics, speakers, cameras, displays if applicable. Commercial displays are really critical. There are various manufacturers that make commercial displays that is highly dependent on, an MTR deployment is highly dependent on what version of firmware is deployed, because the MTR actually stops the HDMI sync and restarts the HDMI sync, but inherently to just the MTR application, there's no power on, power off commands. And then lastly, the compute BIOS, and that's critical. In my experience, a specific example is the Intel NUCs. They had some challenges with HDMI that was fixed with a BIOS issue that helped work in conjunction with the MTR application, so that when HDMI sync was essentially initiated in the MTR app, it actually happened, and HDMI signal went out the physical HDMI port. All right, so I'm not going to go through the details of how to gather the Microsoft Teams Room log, but there is a link in this that will step you through how to gather the Microsoft Teams Room logs. What you'll see, this is kind of the output that you'll see from that main PS1 script. And this gives you an idea that the sheer volume of data that script pulls. We can see that there are 1,700 files that are actually pulled in one zipped file that's extracted in this example, 1,700 files to parse through. And that's why going back to the when do problems occur, getting a timestamp and what the actual symptom was is so critical in turning this massive amount of data into something valuable. Without that, it's really looking for a needle in a haystack. The event files, very important. Windows event log files, system, Skype room system, and there are a bunch of others that we'll cover later. 1,100 of those. Now, a lot of them are empty, which is kind of helpful, and we'll kind of go through how do I determine which ones are valuable and which ones aren't. And then there are some TXT and log files, as well as some link logs. They're highly valuable when you use third-party tools, third-party text editors, things like Snooper, that help you pinpoint where problems occur. All right, and this is what the directory structure looks like. All right, we're going to start with the hardware, the devices.txt file. There are really 2 big things that this helps provide. The first thing, it's a snapshot in time of devices that are connected to the system. Both their USB, PNP device, so what kind of USB devices, what's the VID, the vendor identifier, as well as the PID, the product identifier, and then the commercial name or the product name, what you would typically see in, let's say, something like Device Manager. These are critical in carrying through the rest of the logs when we're trying to troubleshoot, is this thing connected? Did it get disconnected? Documenting which devices in these paths right here is going to really help you do searches through many different log files and figure out correlations to event times where things occur and the end user symptoms or problems that occurred. DXDiag, primarily related to DirectX. It's not a nice centralized log file that gives you information about the Windows build that's so critical in MTR supportability, CPU, BIOS, memory information, which as long as you're using a certified device, the CPU and the memory should be fine, but the BIOS, there's certainly BIOS updates that occur that optimize MTR solutions, and it gives you a snapshot view of the system. Which specific drivers, where are they, which DLLs are loaded. This is a nice thing to be able to simply hand over to Microsoft support or the OEM support and say, you know, this is the system that I have. This meets my standard operating procedure. Every other system works. Okay, why is this one not working? And it allows you to build correlations between systems that have problems and systems that don't. Codex really doesn't apply unless you're deep diving into audio video troubleshooting, which we're not going to get into today, but having that information listed, again, very helpful in troubleshooting when you're in those scenarios. And then the MTR and / Skype room system does report through WER, the Windows error reporting. So this DXDiag also gives you the list, I think it's the last 9 or 10 WER events, which is helpful in correlating. I had an application crash at this time, or I had an application error at this time, and it's reported here, and the end user said, hey, that's about that time that problem occurred. You can start digging in and figuring out where should I start looking. All right, the event logs, very helpful, and you'll see that in this event log, which is probably, it's one of the more useful hardware-based event logs, which is the Microsoft Windows kernel PNP configuration, and you'll all get these slides when you're done. It helps you identify a chronology of when devices are plugged in, unplugged, and configured. Go back to the previous slide, we can see that we've got our USB PIDs and our USB vids here. I can tell, okay, yeah, this device, it's currently present, right? Well, the same vid and PID was deleted. Now, some of the extra strings here are different, so there's some software that's going on, doing some things, but I can see that a device looks like it may have been unplugged or removed, deleted through Device Manager. There was some event that caused this specific device to be deleted. Again, helps you start correlating problems that occur. Something else that should save you a lot of time when you start digging into these logs is if it's between 68 and let's say 70K, it's highly unlikely that event log is empty. There's no data in it. So of the, I think, 1,200 event logs, you might have 50 or 60 of them that actually have data. That's a quick at-a-glance view way of digging into the event logs. All right, moving from some of the hardware pieces into service troubleshooting. Primary services involved with MTRs, Exchange Online, we need that for our mailbox. Skype for Business Server or Skype for Business Online, we need that for some legacy connectivity, hybrid connectivity. If you've got some on-prem stuff, that's where our Skype for Business tools are going to be very helpful. And then Microsoft Teams itself. Unfortunately, all of these services put information in various logs, or I should say the logs contain information for most of these services. So there's really not one spot to look today. Things like Azure Log Analytics do a pretty good job of identifying, hey, there are problems that are occurring, and I'm parsing these log files. And the Managed Room portal is also something that's useful, a paid-for service that gives you a little more insight. It's still yet to be determined what's going to be available fully in the Teams Admin Center, but we expect that to come pretty soon. So let's take a look at some of the logs. All right, first one, the Exchange-related log entries. I see I didn't bold this very well, but this is, I'll include the folder structure in the log files. This is in the app, Skype, and Skype Room init folder. And we're focusing in this scenario on web services connectivity. Hey, I couldn't pull my Exchange calendar. In this case, I can actually tell that it works. But this is information that's really valuable in this log file that tells you it pulls the credentials. It's attempting to go to autodiscover. This is the specific URI of the autodiscover request. It's leveraging EWS, obviously, it's autodiscover. And I can see that the autodiscover scenario is successful in this scenario. If you don't see success, you're probably gonna, and it says it's related to the autodiscover service. That may mean you have some Exchange 2010 on-prems, maybe some 2013 non-patched SP1 or there are some other potential auto-discover errors that you can quickly look at this specific file, and this is the Skype room init followed by the version file, and quickly identify, hey, should I be looking at Exchange, how this thing is going out to Exchange, how it's authenticating to Exchange, or should I look somewhere else? Maybe it's just a complete firewall issue. I'm not getting out anywhere. Similarly, the event logs are a very helpful tool in identifying Exchange-related issues. This screenshot is a pretty helpful example of showing some of the high-value items. Script launch identifies what stuff is done when the MTR is rebooted or when logs are gathered. That's really what script launch is for. All the MTR stuff that happens in the behind the scenes is typically gathered in that script launch event log. The Skype room system basically throws events when the system is up and running and events occur. That Skype room system log is what's used to store those events. It also provides the health check so that Azure Log Analytics, now Azure Monitor, can pull from that log and say, hey, is there an issue? And if there's an issue, should I take action on it? In this scenario for Exchange, we're going to take a peek at the Skype room system log and one specific example saying, I think I can tell that there's an Exchange issue. Thankfully, these logs, they're pretty explanatory. At least I know which software component had an issue. And these events are thrown in every MTR. It's a part of the product. In this case, I see the Exchange status general error. It tells me, okay, I should start digging into Exchange. Maybe it's autodiscover, but I know that if it's autodiscover, maybe it's Exchange Web Services, or maybe it is a firewall issue. This gives me the ability to simply pinpoint, okay, this is an Exchange issue, and then I'll take my basic troubleshooting tools of how do I test autodiscover, how do I test Exchange Web Services, and dig in to figure out why can this system not get out to Exchange Web Services. And then lastly, this is always helpful. This is that same file. This is the same file that we discussed 2 slides ago, that Skype room init. It does also cover some of the Exchange Web Services requests. What this does is if I know that I'm getting to an Exchange Web Service where I'm asking for something, let's say a calendar, I know that autodiscover worked. It means I've got the information that I need to be able to publish, request from EWS the actual calendar information. So authentication worked across autodiscover. I'm not on Exchange 2010. In this case, it's requesting Exchange 2013 SP1. That's the minimum version. It's built into the product. You'd see the same request if it's sending an outbound request for Exchange Online. But in this case, I can tell that this is good because I'm actually requesting information through EWS. All right, digging into some of the broader Microsoft Teams logs. This app, Skype Desktop API Service, is probably the most comprehensive for troubleshooting issues where you can't really pinpoint it right away, because it pulls in Exchange, Skype for Business, Microsoft Teams, as well as the end user interactions. It'll say, hey, a meeting was started. It'll say the content camera was started, as well as a handful of other things. So I would strongly recommend this Desktop API Service that if you're not familiar with it, dig into it. And with your favorite text editor, filter it. There is info, error. There are a lot of sortable fields in that log file that can help you cut through the extraneous stuff and focus on things that may be related to issues that are occurring. A couple of examples. Again, there's a lot of text here. This wasn't approved by marketing, but it's really useful when you're troubleshooting in the field. So the AV device interactions, the Skype room system will always try to use the device that's configured in your configuration file or in the UI. And if it can't find that, this is a pretty nice term to look for, device not found. If you filter based on device not found and you see a bunch of results that are associated with a time frame that an end user had an issue, maybe there was a problem. Maybe there's a firmware update that needs to occur. It's possible that a cable is bad. But being able to filter and see this stuff through the tens of thousands of lines of code and seeing when there are issues is really helpful in troubleshooting using the Desktop API Service log. Similarly, display connectivity. There's a lot of information about what displays are used for the touch panel, which is, I can tell touch panel is primary display. The primary display in the MTR application is always going to be the touch panel. I can see what resolutions are available. I can see that it starts at XY axis 0, 0, which tells me, okay, this is the touch display. So if the touch display went off, I should probably take a look at the succeeding or the preceding log entries to figure out what happened to this display. And then the bottom two entries are very common when displays are used that don't support low power states. Maybe they require CEC injectors. Crestron and Extron are the two manufacturers that are supported today, I think, by MTRs. And the system itself says, hey, HDMI port turn off, stop HDMI sync. And I know that that actually happens when I see this display off message. Conversely, when somebody walks into the room and the motion sensor is triggered, you should see this display on event. The value that knowing when these messages occur means you can kind of remove the Microsoft software from the equation for the most part. If I see a display on, that means Microsoft's done what they can. They've told the system itself, hey, I need to send HDMI signal out, so I should start looking at either cabling or maybe the displays aren't turning on and I need to enable CEC or a handful of other things related to it's definitely not software. It's tied to some type of hardware interaction because I'm sending that HDMI sync signal. This is another one in the desktop API service that you can focus on how the application is configured to apply Windows updates. It'll actually read from this registry key. Many customers that are in enterprise environments will want to domain join these and apply their own policies. It's strongly recommended to block inheritance in any type of MTR environment, create custom group policies if you are going to manage them on a domain that don't conflict from the MTR product specifications. I think the default update period is 365 days, and in a handful of systems that went out with certain versions, that got reset, something like 153 or 156. So it caused systems to receive Windows 10 1909 before it was fully vetted. So just looking at this and understanding, hey, does it say this should be pushed out a year, or is maybe an enterprise policy, a group policy that I have applied, is that potentially conflicting with the product specs from for the Microsoft Teams rooms? All right, flipping back to Skype Room Init, and this covers Skype for Business, Exchange, and Microsoft Teams. I like this one because, well, quite frankly, it tells you what new features may be coming out before Microsoft can publish them. This is fully public information, right? This is a log file that is created, so anybody can look at this. But we all know that WebRTC join is coming, but we can actually see it in the log file itself. Value of WebEx meetings enabled, false. Zoom meetings, false. And then a handful of other things in here that are help you build that chronology of when you're talking with, let's say, on-site IT support. Yeah, I set that setting. Absolutely, I set it for dual displays. Whereas if I look in the value here, I can see number of front of room displays is configured as 1. I know that there's some kind of conflict, and it provides a level of objectivity and empirical data that you can start trending. What are these settings? What issues do I see occurring with these rooms, and then take the appropriate action to better communicate with on-site IT support, continue to optimize the SOP for the deployments. See if there's anything else in this one. No. All right, moving into the Skype rooms themselves. So the Skype rooms, on the right-hand side, we can, for those of you familiar with Skype room or Skype for Business troubleshooting or link troubleshooting, it's Snooper. And there are some logs that are included that are helpful, especially if you're in a hybrid environment, you're still Skype for Business on-prem or Skype for Business online only, that these logs are still created. And it gives you specific messaging on what's being done with the Skype login information, web services, the LWS step. The SIP ladder flows, which is really helpful when you're troubleshooting firewall issues or media optimization issues. You know, I do have 2 clients that are going point to point. Are they going out through the firewall? Are they using ICE for stun and turn to figure out, am I connecting through my firewall? Am I forcing my end users to connect through the cloud service and then back? This is a great log. I wouldn't recommend using this just with a text editor. Download Snooper for sure to parse it, and it'll make your life a heck of a lot easier when you're, specifically if you're in a Skype for Business hybrid environment, or you're troubleshooting 2 different tenants that are trying to connect to one another, and one of them's in islands. This will help you point you in the right direction. All right, now a couple of examples specific to the Teams log itself. We can see using the same directory structure. This is in the app Microsoft Teams log. Example of if I've got a bad password or MFA configured that isn't allowing the password to go through, there's a nice error message for that. So now in the future, you can search for either an SSO failure or authentication failed, and you can identify, hey, maybe somebody mistyped the password for that solution, or as password rotation gets implemented, maybe there's a problem with that service account password. Additionally, you'll see, I think this is the third time we've touched on displays and monitors. This log also gives me an identifier of which monitor am I using for the touch display device. We see that the X and Y axis is 0, 0, which means I'm pretty sure this is my primary display, and this is the monitor ID. You'll find that when cables get broken or when monitors get flopped around, sometimes the MTR application will present what should be the touch screen, and it touches it on the front of room. You can use this data to go back and identify, yeah, this monitor really did. It was put on the front of room display by correlating this monitor ID with the other logs in the desktop API service, and a couple of other tools we'll show in a bit. All right, Bluetooth beaconing. I know this one was in the session description, so I did need to make sure to at least have one piece on it. This is also in the Teams log.txt, identifying that, hey, yeah, the system itself has interpreted yep, I should allow Bluetooth beaconing and I should parse it. This is how you can confidently confirm that Bluetooth advertising or Bluetooth beaconing is enabled on the system and that it is advertising. Now, the logic associated with how Bluetooth beaconing is used is well outside of the scope of this. BLE as opposed to regular Bluetooth, as well as the backend configuration on Teams. I know that Graham Walsh has a phenomenal blog on going through how the Bluetooth beaconing works, how to set up the backend for the best experience. But in reality and in practice, I've seen the range be probably between 1 and a maximum of 15 feet for systems that I've worked on and I'm aware with. So at least in this point, you can confidently identify Bluetooth beaconing is enabled on the system. Going back, displays again, my content is on the wrong display. This is how we can correlate that primary display ID is these two numbers, and we can correlate those with the other logs to figure out which physical display is this actually. And I can identify, since my XY00 axis is likely my primary display, this is the display identifier. And if I were to present content, I could go back into my logs and identify, hey, content was showing up on the screen that was supposed to be the touch panel. Yeah, there was a problem. What happened? Well, the MTR application, somebody plugged in a monitor after it was already booted, and we needed to reboot the system. This is a very common occurrence in MTRs. All right, cool tools. Hopefully you'll get at least one piece of information that's helpful. The first one is we leverage display management, MonitorinfoView. A lot of times we'll ask, hey, is it 4K? Is it 1080p? And currently MTRs support display resolutions of 1080p. Although you physically can certainly set 4K, what's currently supported is 1080p. And this MonitorinfoView actually pulls EDID information, the extended display identifier information, from the connected device. It'll tell you who the manufacturer is, the maximum resolution. As we can see at the bottom here, these are all of the available resolutions for this monitor. So even though today it's negotiating at 1080p, it's possible it could negotiate at a higher resolution at the bottom here, the 2560 by 1440. So it's possible that could cause problems in an MTR application. The refresh rates, as well as low power state options. So these are critical in MTRs, strongly recommended to have a display that supports a standby state, and that's not a full off. Doesn't require pressing a remote, doesn't require sending CEC, that it's simply a low power state. And this is where you can grab that data and say, I know confidently that my display actually has those features because they're negotiated through the EDID. And then the download link for this tool is also at the bottom of the slide that you'll get at the end of the session. Another cool thing about this is I can run this remotely. So if I have hundreds or thousands of systems, I can set up a service PC, I can have it enumerate and pull this, so I can start to get a chronology of what systems are connected and begin correlating when issues occur with hopefully changes to what's actually being negotiated through that EDIT process. This is currently displaying in HTML format. And again, you can run it remotely across hundreds or thousands of devices using a service PC. Since it isn't executable and it accepts command line parameters, my best guess is that it uses WMI to pull this information. All right, I think we just have a couple of slides left. Snooper is the tool that we mentioned before for troubleshooting Skype for Business. These are the downloads. This first get Snooper. If you got 2015 or 2019, I recommend not installing it on front-end servers if you have them. Right, pick a separate PC. It'll require the Visual C++ redistributable. It's a prerequisite for, I believe, both of these installs. And then you can actually open some of those link log files that we discussed earlier in a GUI tool, so you can see what stuff's happening as the registration process goes back and forth or as calls occur. All right, Azure Monitor. This is a tool that's been available, I don't know, it's Azure Monitor, Azure Log Analytics, Operations Management Suite. There are quite a few different names for this as it's evolved. It's a reasonably cost-effective tool that takes some of the data from these log files and puts it in a graphical, actionable user interface. I can see which devices are available. I can see which devices are inactive. If I have hardware errors or software errors, I can tie them to alerts, which can then be tied into third-party tools that use various web services. And I can say, open a troubleshooting ticket so that when the executive comes in at 8 o'clock in the morning, I can start taking action on this. And similarly, when the event is closed, I can close the event in Azure Monitor. And then most applicable probably right now is the Windows versions, identifying, well, in this case, I've got one system at Windows 10 1909, one at 1903, or 3 in 1903, and then a bunch that are just older than that and should be either updated or upgraded to a new system. All right, not sure how I'm doing for time, but I think this is my last slide. What do we cover? What's new? PowerShell script available. So any new system out of the box, make sure you run that PowerShell script. Windows 10 1903 is the recommended version for current MTRs, but if you have 1909, you're probably okay. And the MTR, the Teams Admin Center will be providing a portal for gathering all of this stuff, so you don't need to parse necessarily all of the logs manually, either through remote control tools or otherwise. You'll be able to go to a single tool to pull that information. The hardware, service, and log file analysis, really, they coexist together and are intertwined. You really can't have hardware and service troubleshooting without any kind of log file analysis. And then we also covered some cool tools. So with that, I would love to see many of you at the breakout session that's available at the top. Please make sure to take the session survey. And before I sign off, I'll pass it to Dave if I do have if there are any questions out there.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you, Luke. We do have some questions from the audience. So Derek's come in. Derek Knox, what is the best place to troubleshoot issues with HDMI ingress to the MTR? So what's the best place to troubleshoot issues with HDMI coming into the MTR?
Yeah, the desktop API service will tell you when that's used. That's a really good question. It'll tell you what the valid HDMI ingest is. I don't know if it gives you more details like what the resolution is, but I'd love to take that one as an action item that I can attach to the session.
Very cool. I had some myself. I'm going to take this opportunity as a producer to ask you some questions. So first one for me was the BIOS issue on the NUCs. That's something that I think we may have with some of our customers, but I hadn't appreciated. Is there a central place to check for kind of community discovered or known issues with MTRs?
I don't think so, specific to that one. Our prescriptive guidance for what we call out of the box to optimized is use the Intel driver and support assistant to go to the latest. I know it's not necessarily the most prescriptive way, but I think that you'll probably see the TechNet forums that will probably have the most information. Keep in mind, it's not always qualified or answered by the OEMs.
Perfect. And then I had one more. Apologies for dominating. In terms of the issues with the touch display being presented on the main display screen, that's something that we see quite a lot. We have a couple of stubborn rooms that don't seem to cure that by just a standard restart or replugging in HDMI. Have you seen that, and what would be your things to check or solutions for that problem?
Best guess without a lot of information is when you do restart them, make sure you restart them with the scheduled task, not with just a normal restart, because that scheduled task goes through a bunch of the script check and it calls all of the MTR processes. The downside to that is, as of the previous version of MTR, there's a 20-minute delay. So the first piece is make sure that it restarts not using a normal restart, but using the actual scheduled task that's available through Windows. And the other piece is it depends on if it's a network connected display or a USB connected display. I know Logitech that we've run into that challenge, and that's why we actually have a startup executable script that we continuously update, and making sure that that scheduled task is run as whenever the Skype user logs in, it always looks for a tap, has a delay, and it sets that as primary.
Right, cool. Thank you so much. So I think that's pretty much all the time we've got for this session. If you'd like to talk with Luke following the session, you can find him in the session breakout area, which I will just post directly now into the chat. So it's goteams.fans/brk158. So all that leaves me to do is to say thank you so much to Luke. I think it was a really interesting session, and we had some good questions as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.